You ever have one of those moments where you think, is this really my life? Well, let me tell you about the day my own son demanded I apologize to his rich wife because I made her upset. And when I refused, he actually yelled, "Apologize or get out of my house!" Now, I'm not one to back down, but what I did next. Let's just say nobody at that fancy dinner party saw it coming. What if I told you one dinner party changed my entire family forever? You won't believe what happened when my son forced me to apologize to his rich wife, and what I said in front of everyone left the whole room in shock. Stay with me, because the real twist is still to come. So there I was, perched on the edge of a velvet dining chair in my son's brand new mansion. Yes, mansion, not just a big house. The kind of place with ceilings so high you could lose a balloon in them, and a chandelier in the foyer that was honestly bigger than my first car. I remember thinking, if that thing ever falls, we'll all be pancakes. But I kept that little joke to myself, because this was not the kind of crowd that appreciated my sense of humor. No, this was Tiffany's crowd. Tiffany, my son's wife, was the queen of the evening, gliding around in a dress that probably cost more than my monthly pension. She had that way about her, always perfectly put together, not a hair out of place, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. You know the type. She was showing off her imported everything. Imported cheese, imported wine, imported olive oil, and I wouldn't have been surprised if she'd told us the air was imported from the French Alps. Every time she said the word imported, she looked around the table as if expecting applause. I just kept nodding and smiling, trying to keep my face neutral. But inside I was rolling my eyes so hard I was afraid they'd get stuck. The table was set like something out of a magazine. Crystal glasses, gold-rimmed plates, and napkins folded into little swans. I felt like I needed a manual just to figure out which fork to use. The other guests, mostly Tiffany's friends and a few of my son's business associates, were all dressed to the nines and talking about things I could barely keep up with. Stock portfolios, private schools, and their latest trips to Europe. I tried to chime in here and there, but I felt like a fish out of water. I missed the days when a family dinner meant meatloaf and mashed potatoes, not foie gras and truffle oil. Tiffany made a big show of telling everyone how grateful she was to have me there. "It's just so wonderful to have family join us in our home," she said, her voice dripping with sweetness. "But you know when someone's being polite just for the sake of appearances?" That was Tiffany. She smiled with her mouth, but her eyes were scanning the room, making sure everything was perfect, making sure I was behaving myself. I could almost hear her thinking, "Don't embarrass me in front of my friends." I tried to keep my head down and just enjoy the meal, but then came the wine. Tiffany stood up, holding a bottle with a label I couldn't pronounce, and announced, "This is a very special vintage, imported from a small vineyard in France. Only the best for our guests." She poured a little into everyone's glass, making sure to mention the year and the region and how exclusive it was. I took a sip, and honestly, it tasted fine, but I've never been much of a wine snob. Give me a glass of something cold after a long day, and I'm happy. But then, in a moment that I now realize was my fatal mistake, I looked at the bottle and said, "Oh, I think I saw this at Costco last week." They had a whole display of French wines on sale. I meant it as a light-hearted comment, just trying to join the conversation. I even smiled, hoping Tiffany would laugh with me. But you'd have thought I'd set the place on fire. Tiffany's face went redder than her lipstick, and suddenly the room went silent. You know that feeling when you say something and instantly wish you could take it back? That was me, right then and there. The guests all looked at each other, unsure whether to laugh or gasp. My son shot me a look that could have melted steel. Tiffany set her glass down with a little more force than necessary and said, "Actually, this bottle is from a private collection. It's not available in stores." Her voice was tight, and her smile had vanished. I could feel the tension in the air, thick enough to cut with one of those fancy steak knives. I tried to recover, mumbling something about how Costco has really stepped up their wine game, but it was too late. The damage was done. The rest of the meal passed in awkward silence, with Tiffany barely looking at me and my son avoiding my gaze altogether. I felt like a kid again, being scolded for speaking out of turn at the grown-ups' table. Only this time, I was the mother, and my own son was the one making me feel small. As dessert was served, a tiny, artfully arranged plate of something I couldn't pronounce, I sat there, picking at my food and wondering when family dinners had gotten so complicated. I missed the days when we could laugh and joke and nobody cared where the wine came from, as long as there was enough to go around. Now it seemed like everything was about appearances, about impressing people who didn't really matter. Ever been in a room so quiet you can hear your own heartbeat? That was me, sitting in my son's mansion, surrounded by strangers, wishing I could just go home and put my feet up. I never thought I'd feel like an outsider in my own family, but that night I realized things had changed, and not for the better. After dinner, while the rest of the guests lingered over their tiny desserts and even tinier cups of espresso, my son caught my eye from across the room. He gave me that look, half pleading, half stern, that I hadn't seen since he was a teenager trying to get out of trouble. I knew something was coming, but I didn't expect it to hit quite so hard. He motioned for me to follow him, and we slipped away from the crowd, down a hallway lined with family photos that felt more like a museum exhibit than a home. I could hear the faint hum of conversation behind us, but in that moment, it felt like we were the only two people in the world. He stopped in front of a closed door, his office. I guessed, judging by the heavy wood and the polished brass handle. He opened it and gestured for me to step inside. The room was immaculate, not a paper out of place, with shelves full of books that looked like they'd never been opened. I sat down in one of the stiff leather chairs, and he closed the door behind us, shutting out the laughter and clinking glasses from the party. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, staring at the floor like he was searching for the right words. Finally, he looked up, and I saw something in his eyes that made my heart ache, a mix of frustration, embarrassment, and something else I couldn't quite name. "Mom," he said, his voice low, "you need to apologize to Tiffany." "You made her upset." I blinked, not sure I'd heard him right. Apologize? For what? For making a joke about the wine? For not playing along with Tiffany's little charade? I couldn't help it. I laughed. Not a big, hearty laugh, but one of those nervous chuckles that slips out when you're caught off guard. "For what?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. "Asking about the wine?" He didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. He just stared at me, his jaw set, his eyes hard. "It's not funny, Mom. You embarrassed her." "You embarrassed me. This was important to her, and you ruined it." His words stung more than I cared to admit. I wanted to tell him that I hadn't meant any harm, that I was just trying to be part of the conversation, but I could see that he'd already made up his mind. He was standing there, not as my little boy, but as a man who'd decided that his wife's feelings mattered more than his mother's intentions. "Apologize or get out of my house." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the boy I'd raised, the boy who used to run to me when he scraped his knee, the boy who used to beg for one more bedtime story. And now here he was, standing tall and cold, drawing a line in the sand. When did our kids start thinking they could talk to us like this? Did I miss a memo somewhere along the way? Was there a meeting where we all agreed that parents were supposed to tiptoe around their grown children's feelings, afraid of being cast out if we made a wrong move? I felt a wave of fear wash over me. The old, familiar fear of losing him, of being pushed out of his life. It's a fear every mother knows, even if we don't talk about it. The fear that one day our children will decide they don't need us anymore, that we're more trouble than we're worth. I thought about all the years I'd spent raising him, all the sacrifices I'd made, all the love I'd poured into him. Was it really possible that one awkward comment could erase all of that? But then, just as quickly, another feeling rose up inside me, something stronger, fiercer. I remembered who I was. I remembered the values I'd tried to teach him: honesty, kindness, respect. I remembered the nights I'd stayed up late, worrying about how to make ends meet, how to give him the best life I could. I remembered the pride I'd felt watching him grow into the man he was today, and I realized that I hadn't raised him to treat his mother like this. I hadn't raised him to put appearances above family, to value someone's feelings over the truth. I took a deep breath and looked him in the eye. "All right," I said, my voice steady. "I'll apologize, but I'm going to do it my way. He seemed relieved, but I could tell he didn't quite trust me. Maybe he thought I'd make things worse, or maybe he just wanted the whole thing to be over. Either way, I stood up, smoothed my dress, and walked out of the office with my head held high. As I made my way back to the dining room, I could feel the eyes of the guests on me, their curiosity barely concealed. I wondered what they'd think if they knew what was really going on behind the scenes. If they knew that beneath all the glitter and glamour, this family was just as messy and complicated as any other. I wondered if Tiffany was waiting for me, rehearsing her own version of events, ready to play the victim in front of her friends. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I'd spent too many years worrying about what other people thought. Too many years biting my tongue to keep the peace. Not tonight. Tonight, I was going to stand up for myself, for my son, for the family I'd worked so hard to build. And if that meant making a scene, so be it. Sometimes, you have to shake things up to remind people what really matters. As I reached the doorway, I paused for a moment, gathering my courage. I could hear Tiffany's laughter, brittle and forced, floating above the chatter. I smiled to myself, knowing that whatever happened next, I was ready. I was going to apologize, yes, but on my own terms. And I had a feeling that this was one dinner party nobody would ever forget. I walked back into the dining room, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. The room was still buzzing with the low hum of conversation, but as soon as I stepped through the doorway, it was as if someone had pressed the mute button. Every head turned in my direction, forks paused mid-air, and even the clinking of glasses seemed to stop. Tiffany was sitting at the far end of the table, dabbing her eyes with a napkin in a way that would have made any soap opera star proud. She looked up at me, her face a perfect picture of wounded dignity, and for a split second, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and walked the length of the table, feeling every pair of eyes following me. I could see my son out of the corner of my eye, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping the edge of the table. He looked like he was bracing for a storm, and in a way, he was. I stopped right in front of Tiffany, who was now sniffling delicately. Her friends gathered around her like a flock of well-dressed hens. I looked her right in the eyes, refusing to let her look away, and I spoke in a voice that was calm, clear, and just loud enough for everyone to hear. "Tiffany," I began. "I'm sorry." The room seemed to lean in, waiting for the rest. "I'm sorry that you feel the need to pretend. I'm sorry that you think expensive things make you better than others. And I'm sorry that my son can't see through it." For a moment, there was absolute silence. You could have heard a pin drop, or, more likely, a pearl earring. Tiffany's mouth fell open, her eyes wide with shock. The guests looked at each other, unsure whether to gasp or applaud. One woman actually snorted into her wine, trying to stifle a laugh. But I wasn't finished. I took another breath, feeling years of frustration and disappointment rising up inside me. "But most of all," I continued, my voice steady, "I'm sorry for anyone who thinks love can be bought. Because real family, real love, that's not for sale." I let the words hang in the air, watching as they landed on each person in the room. Some looked away, uncomfortable. Others nodded, as if I'd said something they'd been thinking all along but were too afraid to say. Tiffany's face crumpled, her carefully applied makeup starting to smudge. She looked around the table, searching for support, but her friends suddenly seemed very interested in their plates. My son looked like he'd swallowed a lemon, his face pale and drawn. For a moment, I wondered if I'd gone too far, if I'd just burned the last bridge I had with him. But then I remembered all the times I'd kept quiet, all the times I'd let things slide for the sake of peace. Not tonight. Tonight, I was speaking my truth, and if that made people uncomfortable, so be it. The whispers started almost immediately, little ripples of conversation spreading out from the center of the table. "I caught snippets. Did you hear what she said? Well, she's not wrong. I always thought Tiffany was a bit much." And I realized that I wasn't the only one who'd noticed the cracks in Tiffany's perfect facade. For years, she'd built her life around appearances, collecting expensive things and showing them off like trophies. But in that moment, all the designer labels and imported wines in the world couldn't protect her from the truth. I stood there for a moment longer, letting the silence settle, then turned and walked back to my seat. My hands were shaking, but I felt lighter than I had in years. I glanced at my son, hoping for a sign, anything that he understood why I'd done it. But he just stared at his plate, his face unreadable. Tiffany, meanwhile, was trying to compose herself, but the damage was done. The mask had slipped, and everyone had seen what was underneath. As the dinner party limped along, the atmosphere had changed. The easy laughter and forced politeness were gone, replaced by an awkward tension that nobody seemed able to break. People started making excuses to leave early, gathering their coats and murmuring polite goodbyes. Tiffany disappeared upstairs, her friends trailing after her, and my son was left standing in the middle of the room, looking lost. I sat quietly sipping my coffee, feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness. I hadn't wanted to hurt anyone, least of all my son, but I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when it so clearly wasn't. Sometimes the truth hurts, but it also heals. I hoped that, in time, my son would see that. As the last guest left and the house finally grew quiet, my son walked over to me. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, hands in his pockets, staring at the floor. Finally, he looked up, his eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in a long time: vulnerability. "Mom," he said quietly, I don't know what to say." I reached out and took his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You don't have to say anything," I told him. "Just remember, real love isn't about things. It's about truth and forgiveness and family." He nodded, and for the first time that night, I saw a glimmer of understanding in his eyes. Maybe things wouldn't be perfect, but at least we were finally being honest, with each other and with ourselves. And that, I realized, was worth more than all the imported wine in the world. The next morning, I woke up with a heaviness in my chest, the kind that comes after a storm. I lay in bed for a while, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment from the night before. The words I'd spoken, the looks on their faces, the way the room had gone so still you could almost hear the truth settling in. I wondered if I'd done the right thing, if I'd gone too far, or if maybe, just maybe, I'd finally said what needed to be said. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat by the window, watching the sun rise over the quiet street, the world outside so peaceful compared to the chaos swirling in my mind. It didn't take long for the phone to start ringing. First, it was my sister, who'd heard about the incident from a friend of a friend who'd been at the party. "You did what?" she asked, half shocked, half proud. I told her the whole story, and by the end, she was laughing so hard she nearly dropped the phone. "Well, someone had to say it," she said. "I just wish I'd been there to see Tiffany's face." I smiled, feeling a little lighter. Maybe I wasn't the villain after all. But as the day went on, the calls kept coming. Some were from old friends, some from distant relatives, all wanting to know what had really happened. It seemed my little speech had made the rounds faster than a wildfire. Everyone had an opinion. Some thought I was brave, others thought I was reckless, but most agreed on one thing. It was about time someone called out the nonsense. I realized then that I wasn't alone. So many of us, especially women of a certain age, have spent our lives biting our tongues, keeping the peace, letting things slide for the sake of family. But sometimes, enough is enough. By mid-afternoon, I was starting to feel almost normal again, until my phone rang one more time. This time it was my son. His voice was shaky, softer than I'd heard in years. "Mom," he said, "can we talk?" I could hear the weight in his words, the regret, the confusion. I told him to come over, and within the hour, he was standing in my kitchen, looking like a little boy who'd lost his way. He sat down at the table, his hands fidgeting with the edge of his sleeve. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and tired. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I should never have treated you that way. I don't know what got into me. I wanted everything to be perfect, you know? I wanted Tiffany to be happy, and I thought if I just went along with it, everything would work out." He shook his head, a bitter smile on his lips. "Turns out, I was wrong." I reached across the table and took his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Son," I said, "I love you. But don't ever let anyone make you forget where you came from. All this—" I gestured around my modest kitchen, the chipped mugs, the faded curtains, the smell of fresh coffee. "This is real. This is what matters. Not the labels, not the price tags, not the show. Family is about love, not things. He nodded, tears slipping down his cheeks. I know, Mom, I got caught up in it all. Tiffany, she always wanted more. More things, more attention, more everything. I thought if I could give her that, she'd be happy. But it was never enough. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine. How do I fix this? I sighed, feeling the years of wisdom settle on my shoulders. You start by being honest, with yourself, with her, with everyone. You stop pretending, and you remember who you are. And you remember that you're enough, just as you are. You don't need to prove anything to anyone. As we sat there, the truth started to unravel. It turned out, Tiffany's luxury lifestyle was all smoke and mirrors. The imported wine she'd bragged about? Costco, just like I'd joked. The designer bag she'd flaunted at every gathering? A knockoff, bought online for a fraction of the price. Even the stories she'd told about her glamorous upbringing were more fiction than fact. One by one, the little lies came to light, and with them, the illusion she'd worked so hard to create began to crumble. My son told me how embarrassed he felt. How he'd ignored the warning signs because he wanted so badly to believe in the dream she'd sold him. I listened, my heart aching for him, but also feeling a strange sense of relief. Maybe now he could finally see the truth. Not just about Tiffany, but about himself, about what really mattered. In the days that followed, things changed. Tiffany's friends stopped calling, the invitations to fancy parties dried up, and the house that had once seemed so full of life now felt empty and cold. My son spent more time with me, coming over for dinner, helping around the house, just being present. We talked, really talked, for the first time in years. It wasn't always easy, there were tears and apologies and moments of awkward silence, but it was real. And that, I realized, was all I'd ever wanted. Ladies, sometimes standing up for yourself means standing alone. It means risking the anger, the judgment, the loneliness that comes with speaking your truth. But trust me, it's worth it. Because when the dust settles, when the masks come off, and the truth is all that's left, you'll know you did the right thing. And if you ever find yourself in a room full of fakes, remember, you're the real deal. You're the one with the courage to be honest, to love fiercely, and to never, ever forget where you came from. If you enjoyed this story, hit that subscribe button. Let's stick together, share our stories, and remind the world you can't put a price tag on self-respect. Have you ever had to stand up for yourself in a tough situation? Tell me in the comments. I'd love to hear your story.